Have you ever poured your heart and years of your life into building something, only to be cast aside by the very people you trusted most? This is the story of Lisa Reynolds, a brilliant executive who saved her family's company only to be betrayed by her father and brother. But she didn't break. She fought back with strategy and silence. Ready to see how power is truly claimed? Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more powerful, inspiring stories like this one. I hadn't expected anything unusual that evening. Reynolds' family dinners were always predictably formal: pressed linen napkins, polished silverware, and a curated menu sent out in advance. We gathered at my father's estate in Greenwich, Connecticut, surrounded by extended family and long-time business associates. The dining room was all marble floors and gold chandeliers, a setting meant to impress more than comfort. I sat at the far end of the table, nursing a glass of Merlot, watching my father, David Reynolds, prepare to make one of his signature toasts. "To family," he said, raising his glass, "and to the next chapter for Reynolds Logistics." There were scattered murmurs of agreement, a few lifted glasses, and the sound of cutlery pausing midair. I returned the gesture with a polite smile, though my thoughts were elsewhere. 12 years of my life had gone into that company. When I joined at 24, Reynolds Logistics was barely breathing. My father's old, school mindset, refusal to modernize, and narrow focus had nearly driven it into the ground. I had stepped in, rebuilt the systems, overhauled the technology, secured national contracts, and grown our revenue from a shaky $3 million to a stable $75 million enterprise. I had given up everything for it. Tonight I thought, maybe he'd finally acknowledge that. Then he placed a hand on my younger brother Ethan's shoulder, turned to the table, and said calmly, "Starting next quarter, Ethan will be stepping in as CEO." The word sliced clean through me. A pause followed, then polite applause. I smiled as if my father hadn't just unraveled 12 years of my work in one breath. Ethan accepted the congratulations like he'd earned them. But I knew better. Ethan had spent the last decade failing at one startup after another. He wasn't a builder. He was an opportunist. But they had miscalculated. They thought I'd accept it quietly. Tomorrow, they'd learn otherwise. That night, I barely slept. I lay awake in my Manhattan apartment, staring at the ceiling while the city pulsed faintly beyond the windows. The betrayal played on a loop in my mind. My father's steady voice, the way he smiled as he made the announcement, the pride in his eyes as he placed a hand on Ethan's shoulder. It wasn't the surprise that kept me awake. It was the clarity. My father had made his decision long before that toast, and the dinner had never been about recognition. It had been about succession. I was just there for appearances. But appearances had never fooled me. Not growing up in the Reynolds household. From the time I was a child, I'd understood that in my father's world, sons were heirs and daughters were supporters. No matter how hard I worked, I was always the fill-in, the one holding the company together until the real leader arrived. I had spent 12 years proving him wrong, and now he had tried to erase it all with a single sentence. But what neither he nor Ethan realized was that I had never once operated under the illusion that I'd be rewarded for my loyalty. I hadn't built Reynolds Logistics for praise. I had built it to last. And I had made sure that the power structure would reflect that. At 3 a.m., I got out of bed and walked into my home office. I turned on the desk lamp, opened my laptop, and pulled up a folder labeled Governance. Inside were digital copies of every executive agreement, ownership certificate, and board resolution. I had drafted them, negotiated them, signed them. Every clause, every loophole. I knew them better than anyone else. Including the one that would bring this so-called transition to a sudden, irreversible halt. The early days of Reynolds Logistics weren't glamorous. When I joined the company at 24, fresh out of Wharton, the business was on the edge of collapse. My father had built it from scratch, sure, but his stubborn refusal to adapt had become its greatest liability. The company was bleeding cash, stuck in outdated processes, and struggling to hold on to even modest regional clients. I didn't walk into a corner office. I walked into chaos. I spent nights hunched over spreadsheets, days chasing down clients who hadn't returned calls in months, and weekends writing proposals just to keep the lights on. I invested not only time and energy, but personal funds when the company needed it most. I made sacrifices no one asked for, because I believed in the company's potential, even when no one else did. By the end of my second year, we'd stabilized. By year 5, we were profitable. By year 10, Reynolds Logistics had contracts with national retailers, a proprietary logistics platform I helped develop, and a growing reputation as an innovative force in the industry. I had built a management team from scratch, restructured operations, and launched our digital transformation plan. And when we crossed the $75 million valuation mark earlier this year, it felt like all those sleepless nights had finally paid off. But none of that mattered at the dinner table last night. To my father, I had always been the backup plan, the one who stepped in because no one else would. Ethan, however, was his ideal. Charming, presentable, and most importantly, male. My father clung to legacy like it was law. And now, with the company thriving, he wanted to rewrite history and hand the legacy to his son, erasing me in the process. But Reynolds Logistics wasn't just thriving. It was protected. Because while they had been looking at titles, I had been quietly securing something far more valuable: control. By the time most people noticed what Reynolds Logistics had become, I had already built the framework that made it bulletproof, from the inside out. While my father was busy attending conferences and Ethan was dabbling in venture capital, I was in the trenches learning every corner of the business. I didn't just know the logistics platform. I designed half of it. I didn't just approve vendor contracts. I negotiated them. And I certainly didn't just inherit my position. I earned every ounce of it. I knew early on that legacy companies often get trapped by assumptions. The belief that the oldest child will run the business, that leadership is handed down instead of earned. I never bought into that narrative. So, quietly, deliberately, I put safeguards in place. When my father asked for capital to expand in 2017, I didn't just write a check. I asked for equity. When we faced a legal crisis in 2019, and I resolved it by personally covering settlement costs, I didn't do it for gratitude. I took shares. All of it was legal. All of it was signed. All of it was real. But none of it was discussed at family dinners. That's how I liked it. Over time, my stake in Reynolds Logistics grew, first 35%, then 50%, and eventually 60%. A controlling interest, one my father either overlooked or chose to forget, assuming I'd never challenge his authority. But I wasn't a placeholder. I was the architect. And while they were toasting Ethan's coronation over crystal stemware and filet mignon, I was sitting in my home office with a thumb drive full of corporate agreements, board resolutions, and a strategy I had refined over the past 5 years. This wasn't revenge, it was execution. The next morning, I would walk into that building not as the daughter who got passed over, but as the CEO with the legal weight to stop their transition dead in its tracks. I arrived at the Reynolds Logistics headquarters at 8:45 a.m., 15 minutes earlier than usual, though I'd barely slept. I parked in my usual reserved space, stepped out in a sharp navy suit, and walked through the glass front doors like I had for over a decade. But today, everything felt different. The lobby, normally buzzing with conversation and the shuffle of morning routines, was quiet. Too quiet. The receptionist gave me a strained smile, and several employees glanced up, then quickly away. The news had already spread. The whisper network in our company was faster than any press release. Everyone had heard about the dinner, the announcement, the new CEO. Some looked uncertain, others outright avoided eye contact. They weren't sure where to place their loyalty now. But I didn't flinch. My heels clicked against the marble floor with purposeful rhythm as I headed toward my office. I wasn't here to plead for position. I was here to execute a plan. Inside my office, I shut the door and pulled up the company's legal structure documents. Everything I needed was already queued: the shareholder agreements, the equity distribution files, the corporate bylaws. I reviewed them one final time, not because I doubted myself, but because I wanted to savor what was about to happen. At precisely 9:00 a.m., there was a knock, sharp, deliberate. I didn't respond. The door opened anyway, and in walked my father and Ethan, both wearing smug smiles like they'd already claimed the crown. My father's tone was casual, falsely warm, the kind of calm that assumed control. "Lisa," he said, "I assume you're aware of the transition. Ethan will need your support during the handover process." I leaned back in my chair, fingers steepled, eyes steady. "I am aware," I said. "But I think you're the ones misunderstanding what's about to happen." My father's confident smile barely faltered. He was used to being the one with the final word, used to seeing compliance in my eyes. He gestured toward Ethan, who stood beside him in an expensive tailored suit, like he'd stepped out of a magazine spread, rather than an operations meeting. "Let's not make this harder than it needs to be," my father said smoothly. "This is a family decision. You'll stay on in an advisory role for continuity." "Of course." Ethan nodded as if it were a done deal, already imagining his name on the corner office door. I tapped a button on the remote resting on my desk, and the large screen on the wall behind me blinked to life. I turned it so they could both see. Displayed in crisp, black text was a document dated August 17, 2015. The Executive Shareholders Agreement, signed by all three of us. Me, my father, and Ethan. I stood and walked to the screen, highlighting a clause with a red cursor. "You recognize this, I'm sure," I said, my voice calm, almost conversational. "According to this agreement, any change in executive leadership must be approved by all majority shareholders." My father's brows furrowed, and Ethan shifted uncomfortably. "So," Ethan said, his confidence flickering, "Dad and I are in agreement." I smiled. "That's nice, but unfortunately for both of you, you don't hold majority control." "I do." I walked back to my desk and opened a second document, my equity ledger. As of the last signed agreement, I hold 60% of Reynolds Logistics. That makes me the majority shareholder. "Which means you don't get to make this decision without my approval." My father went pale. Ethan's mouth opened slightly, like he was still trying to catch up to the moment. I could see the panic starting to bloom behind his eyes. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel anger or hurt. I felt something far sharper: satisfaction. Ethan stepped forward, his voice rising with disbelief. "You've got to be bluffing. 60%. That's not possible." I didn't move. I didn't even blink. Instead, I calmly slid a printed document across the desk toward him. "It's all right there. Legal filings, notarized agreements, certified equity transfers. You can have your lawyer review them if you'd like, but the numbers don't lie." He snatched the papers with a trembling hand, his eyes darting across the page. The color slowly drained from his face as he read, confirming what I had just said. My father remained standing, stiff, unreadable. But his silence told me everything I needed to know. He remembered each transfer, each moment he'd needed my resources to keep the company alive, and the deals he made without fully considering the cost. I leaned back in my chair. "Let me remind you," I continued, keeping my voice composed. "In 2017, you needed capital for the Texas expansion. You signed over 15% of your shares in exchange for my investment. 2 years later, during the litigation with Mid-Atlantic Freight, another 10% came to me as collateral you never reclaimed. Add that to my original 35%, and, well, here we are." Ethan looked up, eyes wide. "You planned this?" I smiled faintly. "No, I protected myself." "There's a difference." I stood slowly and stepped around the desk until I was face to face with both of them. "You underestimated me. Both of you. You thought I'd accept being passed over. Because I'm your daughter, not your son. Because I didn't ask for recognition. But I didn't build this company to be handed crumbs at the end. I looked at Ethan, voice steady. You will not be CEO. You may stay on in a limited advisory role. Or you may walk away, and I'll buy out your shares at market value. My father's jaw clenched, his fists curling at his sides, but he didn't speak. Because he knew there was nothing left to say. Ethan stormed out first, the crumpled documents still clutched in his hand like they might somehow rewrite the truth if he held them tightly enough. The office door slammed behind him, but I didn't flinch. I kept my eyes on my father, who remained frozen in place, shoulders squared but face blank. For a long moment, the silence between us was heavier than any argument. Finally, he exhaled and spoke, his voice quieter than I expected. You're making a mistake, Lisa. This isn't how families treat each other. I met his gaze without blinking. No, Dad. You made the mistake. You treated me like a placeholder. Like I was temporary. You decided I didn't belong at the head of the table, even though I built the table. He looked away, jaw tightening. I continued, slower now, more measured. I gave you everything. My 20s, my time, my money. I rebuilt your company from the ground up. And you were going to give it all away to someone who never earned it. His lips parted as if he wanted to defend Ethan, but even he knew it would be a weak argument. Instead, he tried another tactic. We can fix this, he said. Reorganize things, bring you both in equally. Make it work as a team. I shook my head. It's too late for that. This company is no longer a family legacy. It's a business. And I'm not splitting it with someone who thought he could steal what I've built, just by showing up to dinner. For the first time, I saw it in his eyes, realization, maybe even a little fear. He had assumed I would always wait my turn, that I'd smile and stay silent, but I had outgrown that version of myself years ago. I had waited long enough. And now Reynolds Logistics was mine, fully, officially, unapologetically. The silence didn't last. By the next morning, the entire office was buzzing with whispers. No formal announcements had been made yet, but the rumors moved fast, faster than truth. Some employees watched me with quiet respect, others with caution. A few avoided eye contact entirely, unsure of which side would come out on top. I knew how this worked. It wasn't just about contracts or shareholder percentages anymore. It was about perception. Power didn't just have to exist. It had to be seen. Ethan wasn't going to walk away quietly. That wasn't his style. By noon, I was already hearing reports that he had reached out to senior staff, board members, even former vendors. He was playing the role of the wounded hare, betrayed by his own sister, painting himself as the rightful successor wronged by an ambitious, cold-hearted executive. My father, unsurprisingly, wasn't far behind. He didn't call meetings or confront me directly. He did what he'd always done best. Played the game behind closed doors. A phone call here, a lunch meeting there, always planting seeds of doubt, while pretending to stay above the fray. It was calculated. Dangerous. And it could work. If they managed to sway enough board members or executives, they could stage a coup. Not legally, but culturally. Undermine my authority, isolate me. Make day-to-day leadership impossible. That's how these battles were won, not in conference rooms, but in hallways and group chats, during after-hours drinks and casual comments meant to travel. I didn't panic. But I didn't dismiss it either. I called an emergency executive meeting for that afternoon. No agenda. No titles. Just a room, a projector, and the truth. If they wanted to question my leadership, I'd make sure they understood exactly who was holding this company together, and who had only ever coasted on a last name. I was done being quiet. Let the war begin. That afternoon, I walked into the boardroom 10 minutes early. The walls were glass, the tables sleek and modern, like the company I had built. One by one, the executive team filed in. Some avoided my gaze, others offered tight nods. The atmosphere was tense, humming with uncertainty. They had all heard something by now. Maybe from Ethan. Maybe from my father. They were waiting to see how I would handle it. Waiting to see if I was the leader worth following, or the villain of someone else's story. I didn't wait for formalities. As soon as the last seat was filled, I stood and said evenly, "Let's not waste time. I know there have been conversations, private meetings, whispered calls. I know some of you have been approached with offers." Several heads snapped up, and a few eyes darted away. "I also know that you're all wondering whether my leadership is sustainable. So let's make that clear right now." I clicked the remote, and the screen behind me lit up with a presentation. It wasn't flashy. Just numbers, charts, and hard data. In the past 5 years under my leadership, we've expanded into 6 new regional markets. Revenue has grown 300%. Our logistics software has been licensed by 3 Fortune 500 companies. We have 0 debt and a 98% client retention rate. That didn't happen by accident. I turned toward Paul, our CFO. "Do we have any indicators, any at all, that suggests this company is in trouble?" Paul hesitated, then shook his head. "No, we don't." I nodded. "So let's be honest. This isn't about business. It's about control. My father and brother expected me to step aside out of loyalty, not logic. But I didn't spend 12 years building Reynolds Logistics to hand it over out of politeness." I paused, letting the room settle. And if anyone here believes they'd do a better job, this is the moment to say so. Silence. Not a single hand raised. Good. When I left the boardroom, the air felt different. Lighter, but charged. The executives hadn't just sat through a meeting, they had seen the backbone of the company laid bare. And they'd heard the message beneath the numbers. I wasn't just protecting my seat. I was protecting the engine that had carried all of them this far. Still, I knew the meeting alone wouldn't stop the whispers. My father had decades of goodwill and influence, and Ethan had no shame in spinning whatever story served him. They weren't going to stop with internal politics. They'd take it public if they had to. By morning, they did. A press release appeared on a business newswire. Subtle, diplomatic, and entirely strategic. Harper Logistics remains committed to its founding values during this leadership transition. It read, "While family disagreements are natural, we hope for a smooth path forward." It never named me directly, but it didn't need to. Between the lines, the message was clear: Lisa Reynolds was a liability. Within hours, headlines started popping up across industry sites. "Leadership dispute at Reynolds Logistics raises concerns about stability." Sources say tensions in the Harper family could affect future deals. The angle wasn't new, but the timing was brutal. Investors began to reach out. 2 clients asked for emergency calls. My inbox swelled with cautious, carefully worded emails. I knew what was happening. They weren't trying to fight me with facts. They were trying to wear down my credibility. One quiet doubt at a time. But I hadn't come this far without understanding the rules of engagement. And I wasn't going to play defense. So I made one call, to a trusted investigative journalist I'd helped once, years ago. "I have something for you," I said. "It's clean. Verified. And it'll give your readers a story no one else has." Because if my father wanted to use the court of public opinion, I was more than ready to testify. Within 24 hours, the article dropped. A full-page exposé in one of the most respected business publications in the country. The headline was brutal and impossible to ignore. "Behind the curtain at Reynolds Logistics. Hidden debts, legal scrambles, and the quiet architect who saved it all." It wasn't a hit piece. It was a scalpel, carefully dissecting the company's past with precision and facts. Every questionable deal my father had buried under optimism. Every lawsuit he had smoothed over with vague PR statements. Every financial corner he had cut to maintain the illusion of control. It was all in there. The article didn't slander. It told the truth. It credited me, by name, for pulling the company out of its most vulnerable moments. For financing the expansion. for absorbing risk when the rest of the board wanted to fold. It painted a clear picture. Without me, Reynolds Logistics wouldn't have survived. And just like that, the narrative changed. By noon, I had 3 voicemails from investors expressing their full confidence in my leadership. Clients who had seemed hesitant the day before were suddenly eager to continue partnerships. The doubt faded, and the silence in the halls of the office shifted to quiet respect. Not everyone liked what I'd done, but they understood it. And more importantly, they knew the truth now. My father's influence no longer controlled the room. The myth had cracked. 2 days later, my phone rang. I recognized the number before I answered. "Lisa," my father said, his voice low, tight. "We need to talk." I let the pause stretch before replying. "Do we?" He sighed. "You didn't have to take it that far." I almost laughed. "Neither did you?" He said nothing for a moment, then added, "What happens now?" I glanced out the window of my office, the skyline glittering. "Now, you step aside. For good, because the truth was no longer hidden, and I had no intention of letting them rewrite history again." He didn't argue. Not this time. My father's voice, once full of certainty, sounded smaller, like a man finally realizing he'd bet everything on the wrong horse. "I'll sell my shares," he said quietly. "I'll retain a small investor stake, but I won't interfere." There was no fight in his tone, only resignation. I knew he hated losing, but more than that, he hated losing publicly. And now, after everything, after the article, after the meeting, after the silence from his old allies, he had nothing left to stand on. "And Ethan?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "Gone," my father said after a pause. "Took the buyout and left the state. He won't be back." I nodded slowly, more to myself than to him. I wasn't surprised. Ethan had always been like that. Loud when he thought he was winning, silent when the game turned against him. He'd probably spin the story in his favor somewhere else, play the victim, find another company to latch onto. I didn't care. He was no longer my problem. We sat in silence for a moment, the weight of it all lingering like fog. I had won. Everything I'd fought for, sacrificed for, protected. I had secured it. I had taken control, not just of Reynolds Logistics, but of my narrative, my legacy. And yet, as I stared across my office, I felt something else rising beneath the satisfaction. A strange hollowness. Because while I had claimed victory, I had also severed something that could never be repaired. My family. The father who raised me. The brother I once shared childhood secrets with. They weren't enemies when this began, but they had become casualties. Necessary ones, perhaps, but still real. It didn't feel like regret. It felt like truth. A truth I had known for years, but finally accepted in the world I lived in. Being right came at a cost. And I had paid it in full. In the months that followed, Reynolds Logistics began to transform into the company I had always envisioned. Streamlined, innovative, forward-looking. The old guard, the executives who had quietly aligned themselves with my father and Ethan, were replaced with leaders who shared my vision and respected results over legacy. We updated our systems, restructured departments, and expanded into markets that had previously been considered too risky. Under my father's conservative management, what he had once called reckless, I executed with precision. Within 6 months, our profits had surged, and by the end of the year, we crossed the 100 million mark. I didn't pause to celebrate. Not really. Every milestone felt more like a checkpoint than a victory. There were moments, late nights alone in the office, quiet weekends reviewing quarterly reports, when I'd catch myself wondering how different things could have been if my father had just seen me clearly from the start. But I didn't dwell, because now, finally, no one could deny who had built this company, who had saved it, and who was driving it forward. One evening, nearly a year after that pivotal dinner, I met my father for a quiet dinner. It was his suggestion, surprisingly. We sat across from each other in a quiet restaurant in the city. No press, no family, no business agenda. Just two people with too much history between them. He looked older than I remembered, his shoulders slightly hunched, his voice softer. He congratulated me on the recent expansion deal. I thanked him. It was civil, not warm but not bitter either. As we raised our glasses, he said, "To Reynolds Logistics." I clinked mine against his, and for once, I didn't feel the need for his approval. I didn't need his validation anymore. I had built something stronger than legacy. I had built something unshakable, and it was mine. Today I sit in the top floor office of Reynolds Logistics, overlooking a city I once thought I'd have to leave to find success. The skyline stretches wide, glittering in the afternoon sun, but it's not the view that matters. It's what it represents. This office, this company, this empire, it wasn't handed to me. I built it, every inch of it, with strategy, sacrifice, and a quiet fire that burned through every obstacle thrown in my way. There are no more whispers in the halls, no lingering doubts in board meetings. My name, Lisa Reynolds, isn't followed by a question mark anymore. It's met with certainty, respect, sometimes fear, but I'm fine with that. I didn't set out to be liked. I set out to lead. To prove, once and for all, that power doesn't come from legacy or gender or expectation. It comes from execution. And yet, I know the story doesn't end here. There will always be someone trying to take what you've built. Someone who believes they deserve it more, simply because of who they are, or who they know. But I've learned the most important lesson of all: power isn't given. It's taken, protected, and fortified. Day after day, decision after decision, I no longer seek approval from the people who underestimated me. I no longer explain my ambition or soften my presence to make others comfortable. I stopped asking for a seat at the table. I built a better one. When people look at Reynolds Logistics now, they don't see a family business. They see a force. And when they look at me, they don't see a daughter who inherited something fragile. They see a woman who made something untouchable. I don't need revenge. I don't need applause. I have something far more enduring. Proof. And that's all I'll ever need. Sometimes the people closest to you won't see your worth. Until you stop waiting for their approval and start living like you already deserve the life you dream of. Strength isn't loud. It's quiet, strategic, and unwavering. If you've ever been underestimated, let that fuel your rise. You owe no one an explanation, only results. Have you ever had to prove your worth the hard way? Share your story in the comments. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and join our journey of growth and resilience.